各位贵宾早安，欢迎莅临2025总体经济计量模型研讨会。首先，我们邀请蔡宏坤副主席长上台，谢谢。
彭院长，张所长，朱院士、谢院士，蔡院士，我们主计长，陈主计长，他因为现在都在忙着预算，所以他要我来，代为问候大家，然后也祝这个研讨会顺利成功，大家都有很好的收获，谢谢大家。
谢谢副主计长。接下来，我们邀请蔡瑞雄院士致辞。
我刚刚讲说，重复一次，因为刚刚讲说，他们叫我致辞，大概是因为我在这边大概是最老的一位。这个从这个 Macroeconomic Conference 开始的时候我就参加了，所以一直这么多年来，大概20-30年了吧。所以希望非常高兴能够继续看到这么多年轻朋友来参加，希望大家继续支持这个会，我只是这个会能够圆满的成功，谢谢。
谢谢蔡院士。接下来我们邀请张俊仁所长致辞。
好，那蔡副主计长、蔡院士、谢院士、朱院士，我们所非常荣幸有非常多的院士，还有彭院士，各位专家贵宾大家好。那感谢各位莅临参加今年度的总体经济计量模型研讨会。刚刚蔡院士有提到20-30年，真正的数字就是说，从这个许家栋所长任内开始正式接这个所谓的总体经济计量模型研讨会，从1995年第一次到现在31年了。那这个我知道时间有限，可是刚刚听了这个蔡院士的这个起头了以后，我就想说，这个会议的缘由，就我了解，应该是由这个刁锦环院士牵的线。那当时的参与呢，包含这些主计处第3局的尾端局长，还有中央研究院第2任的所长余宗先院士，第4任的李庸山先生，还有刘大中院士、蔡瑞雄院士，还有台大经济系的许正明教授。那这些都是我的老师了哈。那真正的由经济所开始接这个研讨会，大概就是从许家栋所长任内开始，到现在31年了。那今年的会议主题是地缘政治与晶片战略。对台湾来说，2025年真的是一个很特殊的一年，经历美国对等关税的洗礼，却迟迟未见最终的结果。然而在 AI 创新的带领下，出口却出奇的好，也带动国内的固定资本投资。那就主计处的这个资料里面，今年前3季台湾的出口平均季成长接近30%，固定的资本投资成长也达13%。那1-2个星期前，应该是11月28号嘛，我们有开个主计处有开个记者会，那预计今年的经济成长率会高达7.37%， 大概是创15年来的最高。可是大概差不多在同一个时间，经济学人却以一个叫做台湾经济繁荣下的隐藏风险，刚刚都是繁荣，可是有一点风险。那作为封面的故事，那指出台湾的内需疲弱，过度的依赖这个出口，生产力与薪资的脱钩，还有倾斜的产业发展跟日益恶化的所得分配，这些比较长期的结构点出一些问题。那我们今天特别邀请的谢院士进行一场英文的演讲。Professor Xie will give a talk on trade shock in distorted economies。我暂且把它翻译成扭曲经济体中的贸易冲击。那并邀请蔡院士帮我们主持跟讨论。那接下来在台湾半导体的安全布局论坛中，我们邀请张传章总经理来主持，然后施晋吉研究员将以大到不能倒的台积电为题来进行论坛的引言，并且由李文熙特聘教授、黄燕南特聘研究员、连贤明院长以及季昭莹副所长共同进行这个语谈。在上午的演讲跟论坛之后，下午则会有2场的平行场次，有30篇学术论文的精彩的发表。我们再次感谢主计总处历年来的支持，以及蔡副主计长的亲自的亲临指导。同时，我们也感谢这个刘祝安老师、杨淑君老师、许玉静老师、陈明朗老师、杨子婷老师对这次研讨会费心的筹备跟规划，以及许文泰老师、陈乐义老师、简景汉老师以及季君哲老师在议程上的帮忙。接下来我们就进行第一场的专题演讲。那我们先欢迎一下主持人蔡院士。
欢迎蔡院士。
It's me again. Welcome to the keynote speech. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague. Academics say I don't think he needs any introduction in Taiwan. He's a distinguished service professor at Booth, and he's well known around the world, and he has many outstanding publications, and that save the time for him. So, Chen.
Okay, we're good. Okay, thanks for all of you for coming. Okay. So let me just say that when I first agreed to do this summer, I was going to give a policy talk. I was going to talk about the economic policy choices that Taiwan faces. I decided to switch because of there's the enormous discussion, not so much in the media, but in the social media in Taiwan that covered a lot of some of what I was going to say. So I decided to just, to bring down the temperature on the discussion, and just talk about something else. So what I'm going to talk about is this work that I've been doing, in which we're trying to understand how to think about the consequences of trade shocks. Okay, so it's maybe somewhat related to what Taiwan is going through. So here is how I want you to think about it. Think about an economy that faces a trade shock. Okay. There's a change in the tariff, say, okay? The first thing I want you to think about is that the way that we normally think about a tariff is that we think about what's the magnitude of the change in the tariff, okay? But there's something else that I want to drive home, which is that, and I'll show this to you, that it always is the case whenever a country faces a trade shock, okay? That trade shock is heterogeneous, meaning that the trade shock affects some sectors and not other sectors, and it affects some firms and not other firms. So let me give you one example. One example. So I know that, there's been a lot of discussion here about the trade shock that Taiwan faces. When I look at what goes on everywhere else in the world, what Taiwan faces is relatively small compared to what all the other countries of the world. And I'll give you one example. This past summer, the U.S. administration imposed a tariff of 50% on India, ostensibly because India was purchasing lots of Russian oil. So the threat was that you stop buying Russian oil, or I'm going to raise tariffs to 50%. And the Indian government, as opposed to the government of Taiwan, basically told the Trump administration, "Screw you." So tariffs went up to 50%, and they're at 50%. Okay, so we looked at the details of this. Okay, and so the first thing I want to say to you is that so the story about Russian oil is that India did not buy much from Russia. But there was a Russian invasion of Ukraine that everybody knows about, and many countries imposed sanctions on Russia, which had the consequence of many of the traditional customers of Russian oil stopped buying Russian oil. So Russian oil started to trade at a discount, about 30% lower than the price of comparable oil. Two countries that ramped up its purchases of Russian oil were China and India. Okay, so that's the origin of this. Okay, when I look at the Indian customs data, okay, this is what I can see, that the huge ramp up of purchases of discounted Russian oil came entirely from one company. That the 30% discounted oil, okay, it looks like only one company benefited, okay? And the other importers of Russian oil, the other importers of oil in India, they didn't buy Russian oil. They kept on buying oil from from Saudi Arabia, from the United Arab Emirates, at a price that was 30% higher than the price of Russian oil. That's an example of what I mean when I say, so there's a trade shock that presumably benefits the Indian, that benefits India, but it's heterogeneous. And I'll show you some data that in which it's absolutely clear that whenever there's been a trade shock, it is heterogeneous in that sense. Okay? So now just take as given, I'll show you that trade shocks are almost always heterogeneous. Okay? Suppose that trade shocks, then how does that change how we want to think about trade? Okay? When trade shocks are heterogeneous, when somebody gains and somebody else doesn't, there's going to be an additional mechanism, and the additional mechanism that there's going to be that some firms are going to benefit and other firms are not going to benefit. That is, there's going to be a reallocation of resources. Okay, so that's going to be the additional channel that's going to come into play. Okay, now you can ask, okay, why does that matter? Okay, well, there is a case to be made that it doesn't matter. That is, if in fact it's a case that the marginal product of resources before the shock is the same across all firms, then there's this basic, thing that we teach in micro, which is the envelope theorem. I assume that people know what that is. So the envelope theorem, which is that if the first order conditions hold, okay, then all we need to know is just the direct effect of that shock. because the first order conditions hold, the effect of reallocation, which is the additional effect, it doesn't matter because the first order conditions hold. Okay, so that is, if in fact, so let me just say that if an economy is undistorted, then the envelope condition applies, then we don't need to bother with this. That is, all we need to know is, in the case of India, what's happened to the weighted average of the price of oil that Indian companies are buying. Okay? Now, that gets to my second point. That is, suppose that the first order conditions don't hold. Okay? That is, suppose that the economy is distorted. Okay? Then the other thing that you need to think about is the reallocation of resources. Is it reallocating resources towards high marginal product firms, or is it reallocating resources towards low marginal product firms? So let me just illustrate this with my example from India. I haven't told you which company it is, but now I'm going to tell you that the one company that purchased all the Russian oil is this company called the Reliance Group. So if you know anything about India, the Reliance Group is this company owned by the Ambani family, and it's the largest company in India. It's one of these enormous, sprawling conglomerates that is everywhere in India. And in the oil sector, it has a 70% share of the refinery market and about a 70% share of the retailing market. So it also runs a bunch of gas stations. Okay? So why does that matter? Like, why does it potentially matter if it's the Reliance Group versus somebody else? Well, here I don't have evidence, and that's going to be a bulk of what I'm going to try to do. But suppose that it's the case that the Reliance Group in the oil sector, okay, has market power, in the sense that the marginal product is that because of its control over the market, it charges a higher markup. It has the ability to charge a higher markup relative to other firms. Okay? And then the Russian invasion of Ukraine came, and the Reliance Group, I'm not going to go into politics, but you can imagine what the politics were behind this. Why was the Reliance Group the only one that had the ability to buy discounted Russian oil, but for whatever the reason, it did. And what is that going to do, right? It's going to reallocate resources towards a high marginal product firm. Okay? Now the reallocation matters, right? Because what is going to happen, this is what you see in the data, that the market share of the Reliance Group has increased in the oil sector over the last 2 years, okay? And if you think about sort of the consequences of that, a firm with a high markup, this is a firm that is producing too little, okay? So what you see then is, so the way that you want to think about this is that then the high markup firm is going to increase its share of the market, which actually improves allocative efficiency. Okay, so I'm saying that if in fact that was what was happening, right, it's going to improve allocative efficiency, and on top of that, if you believe that the greater market power, okay, because of the fact that it was able to buy discounted Russian oil, is also going to increase the markup that it's able to charge. Its market share goes from 70 to 80, and then it's able to charge a higher markup. So maybe just the way to think about it is, think about so I will say that I have no idea what markup TSMC charges, but presumably the fact that it has 100% share of the market now compared to 10 years ago means that it has the ability to charge a higher to charge a higher markup. So the consequences of this trade shock for India, so let me go back to my example, is that allocative efficiency goes up. Okay, so that is the share of the high markup firm goes up. Okay, and the average markups go up as well in the oil sector. So the economy is better off. Okay, But there's severe distributional consequences, because the reason that that allocative efficiency goes up, it mostly shows up in terms of higher profits for this company, and Indian consumers are paying more. Okay, so that's a story. So then, you can tell the story that, that if President Trump had succeeded in bending India to its will, then they stopped buying Russian oil, then the market share of the Reliance Group would go down, allocative efficiency would fall, and markups would go down. So so the point is that when you have the combination of both things, which is a combination of a heterogeneous trade shock in a distorted economy, then a trade shock is going to have an important effect on allocative efficiency, and it's also going to have an important effect on the distribution of income. Okay, so that's the story. That's the story that we want to tell. Okay, now I can't. So the key is that I need to know the markup, which I don't see. Okay, I can only tell you the market shares, but that doesn't necessarily tell you what exactly is the markup. So that's going to be the bulk of what we're going to try to do here. So what we're going to bring to the table, that's a story that we want to tell, is that we're going to bring to the table new data. And the data that we're going to bring is that we have customs data, so administrative data from customs administrations, okay, from 57 countries in the world. Okay? So that's the data that we are going to use. Okay, so think about this as being, it's essentially administrative records of everything that is coming in and going out of the country. So it's millions and millions and millions of records. Okay, so we have this for 57 countries between 1997 to 2021. Okay, so the first thing that I'll show this to you, so that in this period, whenever there's a trade shock, it almost always is the trade cost coming down. It seems like a quaint world now, from a far away land now. When I look at the data and I see tariffs are falling uniformly over this year, but this was the period. So that's the trade shock that I'm going to be looking at, a reduction in tariffs. Okay. Once the data is available, then there's a whole new agenda waiting for people to look at what's happened to the world, in the last 6 months. And that data should be available in about 2 or 3 years. Okay. So the thing that we can do with this data is, and this is going to be the key measure that we are going to use, is that for every country, for every year, okay, we can look at every firm that is buying stuff, and we can measure the import market share of that firm in narrowly defined products. Okay, and then the data is available at the HS10 level for those of you who are into trade, but we needed to do a lot of work to make those codes consistent over time and across country. So the final thing that we are working with is classification at the HS6 level, but that's still a very disaggregated unit. So the thing that we're going to measure, so the key thing we're going to measure is that for every firm in every country in every year, what is your share of total imports of that HS6 product? Okay, so an example would be, there's a bunch of companies in Taiwan that is buying, buying EUV machinery from the Netherlands. Okay, what is the market share of each firm that the share of imports of EUV machines from the Netherlands? So I've not looked at Taiwanese yet, but I can only imagine how concentrated that is going to be, right? My guess is that it's going to be just one firm, right? That does all the purchases, and the whole again. So this is what we have. So we observe the import market share. but we need to translate that into a measure of market power. That is, we need to be able to make a statement of, what does the import market share mean in terms of the market power of the firm that is buying that stuff. And of course, the data that doesn't tell us what the markup is. It doesn't tell us what the market power is. So this is what we're going to use, right? What we're going to use is the idea that, so we don't observe the markups, okay? But what we do observe in the data is how responsive each company is to a change in trade costs, okay? Because we have data over a long time period. It's a panel, so we can look at a trade shock, and we can see companies of different sizes that are buying the same thing, okay? How are they changing their imports in response? That is, what we can use is the idea that markups, so differences in markups, are going to be associated with heterogeneity in the import demand elasticity. Okay, so that's what we're going to estimate empirically in the data. Okay, and what we're going to show is that import demand elasticities are significantly smaller for big firms relative to small firms. Okay, which in a whole class of models is gonna imply that large firms have a higher markup, and they have a higher markup elasticity at the same time. So that's going to be sort of the way that we're going to do the mapping from what we can observe into something that we don't observe, but is the key object that we want, which is the markup of the firm. So then once we have that, then what we can do is that we can look at a given trade shock, and we can answer the question of, for a given trade shock, what's the aggregate effect, and what's the distributional effect of the trade shock. And I'll show you that once you do this, right, there's a really simple summary statistic that summarizes everything that you need to know, which is the covariance of the cost shock and the markup. That it's this really simple summary statistic, but the whole game, right, is about trying to estimate what the markup is. Okay, so that's it, right? So let me just quickly just summarize what we find here. Okay, what we find is that in the majority of the cases that we look at, so again, these are the cases that again, this is this is the old world when tariffs were falling. Okay, we are now in a new world where tariffs are rising, and I guess I don't need to tell you that the way the tariffs have been rising is hugely heterogeneous, right? What I want to say is that also was the old world. That also was a world, except that tariffs were falling. Okay, so in those cases, okay, the way I want you to think about the welfare effect of the reduction in tariffs is that we've all focused on the direct effect on the reduction in the tariffs. And what we're going to bring to the table is that there's this additional effect, which is very important, which is the effect on allocative efficiency. Okay, and again, just to remind you, you get that additional effect with two conditions, which is that the trade shocks have to be heterogeneous and the markups differ across firms. Okay, and I'll show you that almost is the case. So in most of the cases that we look at, allocative efficiency fell. And the reason that allocative efficiency fell is that the cost is that the incidence of the reduction in trade costs was primarily in the low markup firms. Okay, and these, I'll show you that the loss in allocated efficiency are quite large. That is, in most cases, they're actually larger than I'm going to call the neoclassical effect of trade. That is, the thing that we, and as I said this before, the loss of allocated efficiency is almost entirely due to a decline in the profits of the firm, So what we show is that consumers also, that even when allocative efficiency falls, okay, there are huge distributional effects so that consumers gain even when GDP falls. Okay, so the fall is mostly, maybe this is, I'll indulge myself for 30 seconds that I think that this is a big part of what one thinks about what's going on in Taiwan, about how does what's the mapping between GDP and welfare of consumers in Taiwan. But it's the same issue here, right? It's the same issue here that in this case, GDP falls, but consumers gain. And the last thing I want to say is that the effect of the trade liberalization, this additional effect, this new channel, is much larger in countries that are poor and in countries that are small compared to countries that are big and countries that are rich. Okay? How much more time do I have? 25. All right. So I'm going to have to run through. Okay. So let me quickly run through the setup for you. Okay. It's a minimalist model. Okay. So the model is as follows. Okay. So let me just describe to you sort of the thinking behind this setup. We want to have something in which we can generate variable markups. Okay? The simplest way to do it is to have what is called a two-layer CES. Okay? There are other ways of doing it, and there are other ways of doing it, but this is, I think, the simplest way, the simplest way of doing it. So the setup is that I have a representative consumer where their utility is a CS aggregate of goods, and each good in turn is a CS aggregate of stuff that each firm makes. So it's a double layer CES utility function. So CS demand is just the demand for each product is a function of two prices. It's a function of PGF, which is the price charged by the firm, okay, and it's a function of PG, which is the price index of that good. Okay, and the price index of that good is just a CES price index of the prices of all the firms that are selling the same stuff. Okay, so the CES price index of Indian oil is just an aggregate of the price charged by every Indian company that is selling oil in selling oil in India. So intuitively, why does the share, the sort of the size of the firm matter here? It's because there's this indirect effect that's coming from the aggregate price. Okay, so there's the direct effect of the price that the firm chooses to sell, which is this term here, and then there's the indirect effect because what the firm does also affects the aggregate price index, and the effect of a firm on the aggregate price index is big if that firm is big, and it's small if that firm is small. Okay, that's it. I mean, so then what you get here. Since I have 25 minutes, let me go to this. Okay, so what the first order conditions then? Or what does demand structure? It generates three things. Okay, it generates variable markups. The markup of a firm is, it's just going to be a function of the elasticity of demand that the firm faces, and the elasticity of demand in this case, the elasticity of demand is not a parameter, but it's a function of both parameters and also an endogenous outcome, which is the market share of the firm. So the idea is that if you have a larger share of the market, your elasticity of your elasticity of demand is lower. And again, basically, if you have a large share of the market, you're going to have a very large effect on the CES price of the good that you are selling. Okay? The second thing is there's going to be a markup elasticity, which is how does your markup change in response to changes in your marginal cost? And in this case, the markup elasticity is not zero. In a standard, like in a standard class of models that we use in trade and macro, the markup elasticity is constant. Here, the markup elasticity is not. Also, the markup elasticity is zero. Here, it's non-zero. And the markup elasticity is also going to depend on your share on your share of the market, which is what I write down as EGF. So the larger your firm is, okay, the larger the markup elasticity is. Okay? So here I want to say that these are the two things that I want to know. Okay? So these were the two things that I used to explain what I think the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was on the Indian oil market. But I don't know this. Okay? And this gets me to my third term, which is the third implication, okay, of this demand structure, is that it also has implications for the output elasticity. Okay? And the output elasticity is also non-zero. Okay? And it's going to be decreasing in the share of the firm. That is, a high markup firm is going to be one with a larger share of the market. And in terms of how it's, and in terms of its output, its responsiveness to the same trade cost shock is going to be lower. Okay? And they're all governed by the same set of parameters. So this is going to be the magic that we are going to use, which is that the output elasticity is something that we can actually measure. Okay? That is, what is that? We can observe the imports of each firm. Okay? Again, I mean, we have this panel administrative data, and we can look at the trade shocks that every firm faces, and then we can see then, what is the response of each firm. Okay? So that's going to be our magic. This is going to be the key thing that we're going to estimate in the data. Once we estimate this in the data, what that allows us to say, what are the parameters of this model? And then once we know the parameters of the model, then we can look at the market share of each firm, and then I can tell you what the markup is and what the markup elasticity is. Okay? So this is our bit of magic. Our bit of magic. That is, we have this rich data, but it's very limited in information. Okay, it doesn't tell us what we want to know. So then this is what we are doing to go from what we can observe to something that we don't observe, but which is what we want to know. And that is sort of, a key trick that we do, as economists. Okay, let me skip this. Now, so everything I've told you is all partial equilibrium. Okay, now I want to get to the general equilibrium, which is, okay, how does this, what are the implications for aggregate utility? And here you can get this really simple expression, which is that the change in aggregate utility is given by the very first term, which is just the sum of the product of P minus C. What is that? That's the markup. Okay, price minus the marginal cost. Okay, multiplied by DQ. Okay, so that is just a very intuitive expression that the change in aggregate consumption, okay, is a function of what the markup is and how much does quantity change, okay, as a function of the initial markup of the firm. That is, it's just a function of the covariance between the markup and the change in the quantity. And again, the basic intuition there is that high markup firms produce too little, low markup firms produce too much. Okay, what increases allocative efficiency is if we get the high markup firms, for whatever reason, the high markup firms to produce more and the low markup firms to produce less. That's all that this is saying. Okay, that's all that is saying. Now to get out sort of the shock that we are looking at, the next step is to just bring in, I'm going to say, the micro, which is, well, what does the change in quantity depend on? The change in the quantity of each firm. Well, it depends on what the shock is. Okay, so it depends on. So obviously, the quantity that the firm sells, okay, is going to fall whenever tariff shocks go up by more for that firm relative to other firms. Okay, and it depends, and so that's what this last expression says, which is that if tariffs go up by more for you relative to other firms that are selling the same thing, you are going to sell less. That's this first term here. Okay, it's just the change in tariff within products. So the competitors of the Reliance Group, okay, their cost, that is, their competitors, even if their tariffs, their cost did not change, the average cost fell, but they didn't benefit from it. It was their competitor that benefited from it. So the competitors of the Reliance Group, their share of the market fell. Okay. The other thing too is what happens to the change in the cost of your product relative to all of the other products in the economy. So what happened to the price of imported oil in India relative to the price of imports of all the other stuff that India is buying from the rest of the world? Okay, so you take that and you plug that in and you get this really simple expression, which is that the change in aggregate utility just depends on two covariance terms. It depends on the covariance. The first term is the covariance across products. Okay, it's a covariance across of the average markup of your product relative to the markups of all the other products and the change in the tariff. The second term in that expression is the covariance within a product, which is what happens to the tariff that you face relative to the tariff that your competitor that's selling the same thing that they face. Okay, so it's a covariance within the product of the markup and the change in the tariff. Okay, and that's all you need to know. Okay, that's all you need. That's all you need to know to solve this. You know, what is this? I mean, it's a macro trade model. Okay, you don't need to simulate. You know, there's nothing that you need to do on MATLAB. It's just you calculate these really simple summary statistics, and you're home free. Okay, now so the thing that we don't know, right? So the change in the tariff we can observe in the data. So again, let me just come back to sort of the key task here is we don't know what the markup is. But once we know what the markup is, then it's a piece of cake to calculate the covariance term. Okay? Let me just, all right, let me just continue. So let me just quickly tell you about the data. So it's essentially administrative transaction level import data for 57 countries. So it's every single firm that is buying and selling stuff from the rest of the world between 1997 and 2021. We have the ID of the firm. We have the product. We have the source country, we have the import value, the quantity, and the year. Okay, so it's very rich data. It's harmonized data. But it's also very limited because all we know is because this is all, we only see the import transaction of the firm. Okay, maybe it's the time for you. I can tell you something. I think something exciting that we are doing. Okay, so think about this data. Okay, we know that they are importing stuff. They're importing stuff, but we know other than we know nothing about them. Okay, so one of the things that we would like to do is to know more about these firms, and all we have is just this information. So something that I think that we've been able to do, it's not yet ready to show, is that we have the names of the firm, okay? And it turns out to be possible to run the names of the firm through LLM models. And there are certain LLM models that can give you a whole bunch of other information about the firm. It's sort of, it seems like magic to me. So OpenAI does a pretty bad job at this. So we have found that Anthropic gives us the best the best results. So give us a few months, and then we will have our first AI generated data set. But it's sort of amazing. Like we basically feed in, 30 million records, 30 of just names, right? And then the model is able to spit back what does that firm do? What's their estimate of the number of employees firm? What are the other things that the firm does? So it's sort of the first time that I am seeing something useful being done with AI tools. Okay, let's not go there too. Anyway, so then we will have more information about these firms. And I think that this is, it has a possibility that for what we do as researchers in economics, I think potentially this seems to me really potentially changing a lot of stuff. That is, that these tools are going to be more useful than just editing our papers, which is what I see most of my colleagues doing. They write a draft and they run the draft through OpenAI, and they ask OpenAI to just rewrite their paper to make it better. These are the ones that are honest. So there are other people, which I'm not going to name, who just ask AI to write the paper for them. Okay, not recommended. All right. But generating new data. Hey. Okay. Let me just tell you just some basic facts from the data. So again, the main thing that we look at is the import share of each firm. Okay, so let me just show you some of the raw moments of the data. This is just the figure on the left is just the distribution of the firm import share of each HS6 product. So each observation is a firm HS6 country year. Okay, so you can see here that the vast majority of companies in our data have a very low share of the market. Okay, 90% of the firms have a share of the market that's between 0 and 10. Okay? But you can see the tail here. There is a visible tail of firms that have between 90 and 10% share of the market. Okay? So another way to visualize this data is to not look at the distribution of firms, but to look at the distribution of firms weighed by the total imports of the firm. Okay? So think of that as the distribution of imports. Okay? And that's the figure on the right. Okay? That this tail is so important that when you look at the distribution of imports, what you get is a very different story. That 50% of imports are intermediated by firms with a 90 to 10% share of the market. Okay? But let me just remind you, what matters for the story that we're telling is not the concentration, right? But it's about the dispersion. The story that we want to tell relies on the dispersion of marginal products. Okay? So what matters for us, somebody may care, other people may care about what the average markup is. The average markup doesn't matter for our story. What matters for us is the dispersion of the markups. Okay? That is there a big difference across firms in the markup that the firm is charging? So what we're going to show you next is raw measures of dispersion in the data. Okay? So first thing I'm going to show you is the dispersion in the market share, okay, across firms for a given product. And that's the figure, and then that's this figure here. So let me be clear about what we are calculating. We're calculating the import share of each firm. We're looking at all the firms in a given country year that are buying the same HSX products, and we're calculating the standard deviation of that share. Okay? And what I'm showing you here is just the average of that standard deviation for each country. Okay? And I'm showing you how that's correlated with the GDP per capita of the country, so that there's a very clear pattern that the dispersion, again, this is dispersion across firms within goods, is higher in countries that are poor, it's higher in countries that are in countries that are small relative to countries that are big. So again, this is not about the average share, this is all about dispersion. Okay, so if this translates into dispersion and markups, the effects that that I'm talking about is going to be much larger in countries that are poor and much larger in countries that are small. Okay, this is a very robust feature of the data. It survives no matter what controls you want to throw at this. Okay, the second thing I want to show you is the dispersion across goods. So what I'm doing here is that for every good, I'm calculating the HHI index. Okay, so think of that roughly, if our theory is right, as a proxy for the average markup, okay, of firms that are selling that product. And then what I want to know is what is the dispersion of that across all the goods that the country is buying from the world. And you also see a similar pattern. That is, the dispersion across goods is decreasing in GDP per capita and is decreasing in the size, in the total population of the country. So again, I just want to say again, this is dispersion. It's not about the level, right? It's not about now. If you are concerned, and there's a wide literature of people who are concerned about the average markup, that's not what this is. Okay? All right. Now, again, what we want to do is to basically go from these measures, go from, I think I'm stuck. Here, let me just go here. All right, the computer seems stuck. If you can just, let me just, while you unstuck me, let me say, okay, so now, again, let me just remind you of how we are going to make progress on this. The key thing that we need to estimate then is the import demand elasticity, okay? And the key thing is how does the import demand, okay, so, and the key thing is then how does the import demand elasticity, what? Yeah, I want to go back. Great. Okay. And the key thing is basically how does the import demand elasticity vary with the size of the firm? That's what these estimates are. So what we're showing you here is basically estimates of the import demand elasticity. That is, it's just a very standard regression of the change in imports of a firm as a function of the change in the tariff shock that the firm faces with a whole bunch of fixed effects. And the key thing is that we want to see whether that elasticity varies with the size of the firm. And that's what we're showing you here. That is, for firms where the import share is close to zero, so think of this as being the tiny firms, the import demand elasticity is like 2.3, right? So in terms of the model, right, like what that implies, a firm with a small share, with a close to zero share of the market, the only thing that's going to matter in terms of their perceived demand elasticity is just the direct effect. There isn't going to be an indirect effect. And in terms of the sort of the basic micro, don't even want to call it a theory, right? Sort of the basic microstructure I gave you. As the firm gets bigger, the more and more important that additional effect is going to be, right? And you can see that here. That is, as you get to firms, as a firm gets bigger and bigger, okay, the import demand elasticity starts to fall. Okay, because in terms of our theory, it's because this secondary effect starts to become more and more, it starts to become more and more important. Okay, so once we have this, then we're basically home free, because from the shape of this estimate, right, we can back out the parameters that also tell us what is the markup of each firm and what is the markup elasticity of each firm. Okay, so that's going to be what I'm showing you here. So then that's what we get in terms of what is the markup of a firm as a function of the size of the firm. So for the firm with like a 0% share of the market, the markup is like 1.7. Okay, as you get to firms with a 50% share of the markup, the markup is 3. Okay, which is, you know, I'll leave it to you to think whether 3 is reasonable or not. So, you know, I'm interested in your guesses of what you think TSMC's markup is. My guess is that it's more than 3. But that's what and then the other thing that it implies is what is the markup elasticity? That is, in response to a change in the cost, how does the markup change? Okay, so for small firms, the markup elasticity is 0, right? I mean, what is that? That's just a single layer CES. Okay, but as you get bigger and bigger, then that additional CES layer starts to become more and more important. You get to firms with a 50% size share of the market elasticity is 60%. I'm told that my time is up, so I just want to say that I'm not showing you the final results, but hopefully that this is the core of what we do, which is this is all we need, right? This is all we need, and then once we have this, then we just calculate those two covariance terms. Then the rest is just basic counting. Okay? All right, I'm going to end here then.
Thanks. As always learn something from Chen-Tai's talk, and I'm sure he point out to very interesting topic for the young people here to study. And it's also the time for questions. We don't have a lot of time, so if you have a question, raise your hands.
Yeah, just a quick question. So I'm confused because just imagine that now you have a positive trade shock. The trade cost actually lower, but then there are actually big firms that they actually import a lot more than the others. And then you say because it's high markup firms and then they actually import more, they produce more. It's actually a gain in terms of allocative efficiency, right? But then you were saying that for most countries, you actually get the result that the allocative efficiency actually fall. So I don't know what's the reason behind.
Oh, it's because that in the data during the period that we look at, it goes the other way. That is it. So there's no presumption, right? That whenever there's so it all depends on the covariance term, right? It all depends on, so in most of the episodes of trade liberalization in our data set, so let me just say, this is 1997 to 2021. If you've looked at the labels, it's basically entirely poor and middle income countries. The richest country in our sample is Mexico. So for those countries, for those years, trade costs fell, and it mostly fell for small firms instead of big firms. So the India story is the other way, right?
Okay,
the India story is the way. But in our data, but there's a lot of heterogeneity across countries as well. What I'm telling you is the average, but there are countries, so it's just a question of data, right?
Okay. But then just a follow-up question is that how come you can see the tariff that's different by firms? I thought tariff is actually by product, not firms.
Okay, so in the data, the way that we're getting leverage is that it almost always is the case that so there are two sources of variation, which is that firms that are importing the same thing, different firms are buying the same thing from different sources, from different.
Aggregate, they are different.
No, yeah, well, they're different in the sense that, I mean, I don't need to tell you that you know, and now this is what shows through in the data as well, that even for a given product, tariffs go down for one country, but not for other countries. Just think about the world that we've lived in the last 6 months, right? So firms are buying the same product, but they're choosing different sources. The other thing too is that most firms are buying from the same thing from a bunch of different sources. And so to the extent that their share varies, that's also, and that's essentially the variation that we use to estimate the import demand elasticity. So again, if there's one thing that I hope you leave this with, right, that when you look at the details of a trade shock, right, I don't think you want to think about it as a homogeneous shock. It always is a hugely heterogeneous shock. Right? It always is, not just, you know, so it's not just Trump, but it's been the world for the last 20 years.
Can I have another question? Just the consumer gains in your terminology is the same as the neoclassical gains, or are they different?
No. There's this additional effect. The neoclassical gains is just the gains from a reduction in the average tariff. That's the neoclassical gain. Here, the consumer gain is essentially the gain from it's so. Think about the gains from reducing consumer misallocation.
Okay.
That's what the gain is, right?
Okay.
So it's an additional mechanism.
Okay, for the interest of time, let us thank the Chen Tai for the wonderful talk. And before we go out, I was informed we have a photo job to do, so please walk outside at the stairs so we can take a group photo.